On the morning of November 4, 1836, Julian Blackwood arrived at the iron gates of what had been Oakhaven Plantation. He was a claims adjuster for the Mobile Fire and Marine Insurance Company, a man whose entire professional life was cataloging disaster. He was a man of ledgers and ink, not emotion. His job was simple: determine value, assess liability, and protect the company's bottom line. But what Blackwood saw at Oakhaven made him pause, before he even dismounted his horse. The main house, once a sprawling Greek Revival mansion that dominated the Alabama landscape, was gone. In its place was a blackened scar on the earth, a chimney standing like a tombstone in a field of ash. The heat had been so intense that the glass in the windows had melted into puddles that re-hardened into grotesque, milky shapes on the ground. Blackwood wasn't there to mourn the dead. He was there because the insurance claim was staggering. 10 men had died in that fire. Not just the owner, Colonel Hiram Sterling, but 9 of his wealthiest neighbors, landowners, cotton magnates, the titans of the Alabama Black Belt. They had gathered for a private dinner to discuss forming a cotton cartel. And in one night, they had all been incinerated. Blackwood walked through the ruin, stepping over debris, until he reached the threshold of what used to be the dining hall. The coroner had already removed the bodies, 10 piles of charred bone found clustered near the doors. It looked like a panic, a stampede toward the exit that failed. But then Blackwood looked down at the hinges. They were heavy wrought iron imported from England, and they were twisted, not melted but twisted inward asterisk. He knelt in the ash, using his penknife to scrape away the soot. The lock mechanism was fused, but the metal told a specific story. The doors hadn't been locked from the inside by a host wanting privacy. They had been barred from the asterisk outside. Heavy oak beams, likely used for securing the house against storms, had been dropped into place across the exterior handles. This wasn't a tragedy. This was a decapitation strike. In one night, someone had locked the ruling class of an entire county inside a burning building and listened to them die. Blackwood opened his ledger. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to document one of the most bizarre and tragic legal paradoxes in American history. A fire that killed the masters, yet resulted not in freedom, but in a descent into a bureaucratic hell that would destroy more lives than the flames themselves. My name is your name, and this is the story of the Oakhaven fire, the story of a perfect murder and the imperfect law that followed. What troubled Blackwood most as he began his investigation wasn't the death toll, it was the silence. The plantation was still populated. The 142 enslaved people who belonged to the Oakhaven estate were still there. They moved like ghosts through the smoke-stained outbuildings, performing their tasks with a terrifying mechanical precision. They weren't running. They weren't celebrating. They were simply waiting. As Blackwood walked toward the ruins, he saw a man watching him from the edge of the smokehouse. The man was older, perhaps 60, with gray, woolly hair and the stillness of someone who has seen everything the world can inflict, and decided to stop reacting. This was Isaac, the plantation's head butler, the man who had served the wine that night, the man who had closed the doors. Blackwood summoned him. The interview took place in the overseer's office, the only administrative building left standing. The overseer himself, a brutal man named Silas Cobb, had been at the dinner. He was dead in the ashes with the rest of them. "Tell me about the night of October 14th, Blackwood said, his pen hovering over the page. Isaac stood with his hat in his hands, his face impassive. "It was a dinner, sir. Colonel Sterling invited the gentlemen to discuss business. The merger." "The merger?" "Yes, sir. They were planning to combine their lands, make one great estate. They talked about it loud enough for us to hear, said they would control the cotton price from here to Liverpool." "And the fire?" "It started in the cellar, sir, the liquor stores. We smelled smoke around 9 o'clock. By the time we raised the alarm, the stairs were gone." "And the doors?" Blackwood asked quietly. He didn't look up from his book. "Why didn't they run out the dining room doors?" Isaac paused. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the smell of wet ash and old fear. He looked Blackwood in the eye, a dangerous act for a black man in 1836 Alabama. "The doors were stuck, sir," Isaac said. "Old house, damp weather, sometimes the wood swells." It was a lie, a carefully rehearsed, plausible, impossible lie. Wood swelled, yes, but it didn't swell enough to trap 10 strong men desperate to escape a fire, and it certainly didn't drop a storm bar across the handles from the outside. Blackwood knew it. Isaac knew he knew it. But here is where the story shifts. Blackwood realized that proving it would serve no purpose for the insurance company. The policy covered fire. It did not cover insurrection. If this was classified as a slave revolt, the insurance company wouldn't have to pay the heirs. But if it was a revolt, the state militia would descend on Oakhaven and execute every person with dark skin within 5 miles. That would destroy the assets, the human property the company might need to liquidate to recover their losses. So Blackwood played the game. "Damp weather," he repeated, writing it down. "And where were you, Isaac?" "I was in the kitchen house, sir, plating the dessert." Blackwood dismissed him. He spent the next 3 days interviewing the other enslaved staff. Sarah, the cook; Ben, the stable hand; a young girl named Clara who worked the laundry. Their stories were identical: the smoke, the panic, the water buckets that arrived too late, the stuck doors. It was a conspiracy of silence, absolute and unbreakable. 142 people knew exactly what had happened. They knew who had barred the doors. They knew who had lit the fuse in the cellar. And not one of them would trade that truth for anything the white man offered. They held the secret together, a collective breath held in the face of doom. But silence can only hide so much. Physics has a way of revealing the truth. Blackwood found the crack in the story on the 4th day. He found it in the ledger of the plantation's blacksmith, a man named Cato. Cato was a giant of a man, valued at $1,800 on the plantation books for his skill with iron. His ledger listed the work he had done in the week leading up to the fire: shoeing horses, repairing a plow blade. And then one specific entry: forging bracket hooks. Bracket hooks are heavy iron brackets designed to hold a dropping bar, the kind used to fortify a door against a siege. Blackwood went to the ruins of the back veranda. He scraped the wood of the doorframe that had survived the flames. There, burned into the wood but still visible, were the holes where new brackets had been installed recently. Cato had forged the brackets, someone else had installed them, and on the night of the dinner, someone had dropped the bar. Blackwood stood there, touching the charred wood. He realized the scale of what had happened. This wasn't just a murder, it was a coup. In one night, the enslaved community of Oakhaven had eliminated the entire command structure of the county's slavocracy. Colonel Sterling, Major Locklear, Judge Palthorpe, men who wrote the laws, men who set the patrols, men who owned the judges. They were all gone. And this is where you, the listener, might be confused. If you decapitate the leadership, if you kill the guards and the masters, why stay? Why were Isaac and Cato and the others still there? You would expect them to run, to scatter into the swamps, to head north while the white power structure was in chaos. The patrol system was broken without its leaders. The confusion would have bought them a 3-day head start. But they didn't run, and that decision is the true horror of Oakhaven. They stayed because they believed in the law. There was a rumor circulating through the quarters for months. It was a whisper passed from cabin to cabin, a spark of hope more dangerous than the fire itself. The rumor was that Colonel Sterling, who had no children and whose wife had died years prior, had written a will that, upon his death, would manumit, free, his slaves. It was a common fantasy in the antebellum South, a hope that sustained people through unendurable suffering. When the master dies, he'll set us free. Sometimes it was true, usually it was a myth. At Oak Haven, the rumor had been planted by Sterling himself. It was a cruel psychological tool he used to ensure loyalty and prevent runaways. "Stick with me," he would say when he was drunk, "and you'll be taken care of when I'm gone." The conspirators, Cato, Isaac, and a field hand named Moses, had believed him. They weren't murderers by nature. They were desperate men trying to trigger a legal clause. They calculated that if Sterling died, along with the other powerful men who might challenge the will, the law would take its course. The probate court would read the document, and 142 people would walk out the front gate as free men and women. They murdered their masters not to escape into the night, but to trigger a legal process they believed would liberate them legitimately. Blackwood discovered this heartbreaking misunderstanding when he spoke to the county clerk in Hayneville on his 5th day in Alabama. Will, the clerk, a man named Abernathy, laughed bitterly. He was wiping soot from his own office window. The smoke from Oak Haven had drifted all the way to town. Sterling didn't have a will, or if he did, it burned in that house with him. And even if it survived, Mr. Blackwood, you know the law. Blackwood did know the law. Alabama, 1836. A master could free his slaves, but the debts of the estate had to be paid first. And Colonel Sterling, despite his grand mansion and his dinner parties, was broke. Blackwood's investigation into the financial records revealed a web of leverage that made him dizzy. Sterling had mortgaged everything. He had borrowed against next year's crop, against the land, and most heavily against the movable property, the enslaved people. The other 9 men who died in the fire, they were Sterling's creditors as much as his partners. They had cross-collateralized their debts. When they died, their estates immediately called in the loans. The Oak Haven fire didn't create a vacuum of power. It created a vacuum of ownership. And in the 19th century South, a slave without a clear owner was not a person. They were a disputed asset. The nightmare began on November 10th. Because there was no will, and because the debts were catastrophic, the probate court of Lowndes County seized the Oak Haven estate. The court appointed an administrator, a man named Thaddeus Moore. His job wasn't justice. His job was to liquidate the assets to pay the creditors. But it wasn't that simple. Because 10 owners had died at once, the inheritance laws clashed. The heirs of Major Locklear sued the estate of Colonel Sterling, claiming Sterling was responsible for Locklear's death and therefore owed damages. The heirs of Judge Palthorpe sued everyone. The lawsuits paralyzed the plantation. For the 142 enslaved people, time stopped. They were placed in what the court called custodial detention. They were not allowed to leave. They were not allowed to work the fields for profit, because who would get the money? They were simply held. Isaac, Cato, Sarah, and the others realized too late that they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had removed the tyrant, but they had not destroyed the tyranny. They had handed themselves over to a monster far colder and more unyielding than Colonel Sterling, the bureaucracy. Winter came. The food stores at Oak Haven began to run low. Usually the master would buy winter provisions, salt pork, cornmeal, blankets, but there was no master, and the court-appointed administrator, Thaddeus Moore, refused to authorize funds for food. "The estate is insolvent," Moore told Blackwood when the insurance agent confronted him. "I cannot spend potential creditor assets on operating costs until the lawsuits are settled." "They are starving," Blackwood said. "They are people." "They are sequestered property," Moore replied, without looking up from his desk. "If I buy corn, the Locklear heirs will sue me for wasting the estate's value." So the starvation began. Blackwood stayed in town, ostensibly to finish his report, but he found himself riding out to Oak Haven every few days. He watched the deterioration. The fences fell into disrepair. The cattle wandered off or were slaughtered for food, and the people grew thin. Isaac, the butler who had orchestrated the fire, aged 10 years and 2 months. He stood at the gate every day, waiting for the sheriff or a lawyer to arrive with the freedom papers he still believed existed. He couldn't accept that he had killed 10 men for nothing. "The law has to work," Isaac told Blackwood one cold December afternoon. "We followed the rules. He's dead. We supposed to be free." "There is no will, Isaac," Blackwood said gently. "There never was." Isaac stared at him, and Blackwood saw the light go out behind the old man's eyes. It was the realization that the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. It was designed to ensure that under no circumstances, not death, not fire, not bankruptcy, would a black man ever own himself. The legal battle dragged on for 14 months, from November 1836 to January 1838. During that time, 19 of the enslaved people at Oakhaven died. Dysentery, pneumonia, malnutrition. They were buried in the slave cemetery near the creek, their graves unmarked because the administrator wouldn't pay for stones. Cato, the blacksmith, was the first to break. In February 1837, he tried to run. He realized the legal trap and decided to take his chances in the swamp. He was caught 3 days later by a patrol hired by the Locklear estate to protect the assets. They didn't whip him. Whipping damaged the resale value. They put him in irons and chained him to the anvil in his own forge. He stayed there for 8 months, living in his own filth, unable to stand fully upright. Blackwood documented it all. His ledger became less about insurance adjustments and more of a chronicle of slow-motion horror. He recorded the rations, half a cup of weevil-infested meal per day. He recorded the deaths. He recorded the visits from lawyers who looked at the starving people not with pity, but with annoyance that their value was depreciating. Finally, in January 1838, the court issued its ruling. The Great Liquidation, they called it. To settle the tangled debts of the 10 dead men, the Oakhaven force would be sold. But not together. To maximize profit, the court ordered them to be sold individually or in small lots to the highest bidders. Families were irrelevant. Mothers would be separated from children, husbands from wives. The goal was purely mathematical: extract the maximum dollar amount from each human body to pay the bankers in Mobile and London. The auction took place on the steps of the Lowndes County Courthouse on February 12, 1838. Blackwood was there. He told himself he was there to finalize the insurance claim. The company had denied the payout on the house, citing gross negligence regarding the security of the doors. But he knew he was there to witness the end of the tragedy. It was a cold, gray day. 123 survivors stood in the square. They were gaunt, their clothes hanging in rags. They huddled together for warmth and fear. Isaac was the first on the block. The auctioneer described him as a butler of refined experience, though aged. He sold for $450 to a plantation owner from Mississippi. As he was led away, Isaac looked back at the group, his eyes searching for his wife, Sarah. Sarah was sold an hour later to a hotel owner in Montgomery. They would never see each other again. Cato, the blacksmith, despite his months in chains, commanded a high price, $1,200. He was bought by a railroad contractor. He would spend the rest of his life laying track, his strength used to build the infrastructure of the society that enslaved him. Blackwood watched it all. He saw the children pulled from their mothers' skirts. He heard the wails that rose up, a sound of raw, animal grief that echoed off the brick walls of the courthouse. By sunset, Oakhaven was gone. Not just the buildings, which were ruins, but the community. The living organism of 142 people who had lived, worked, loved, and conspired together was obliterated. They were scattered across the South, atoms blown into the wind. The fire had killed 10 tyrants, but the law had finished the job the fire started. Julian Blackwood returned to Mobile a week later. He filed his final report. "Total loss," he wrote. "Cause of fire, incendiary origin suspected but unprovable, policy void." He quit the insurance business a month later. He moved north to Philadelphia, where he became a clerk in a shipping office. He never married. He lived a quiet, solitary life. But he kept the ledger. It sat in a trunk at the foot of his bed for 40 years. In 1878, just before his death, he gave it to a nephew along with a note. "Do not let them say it was an accident," the note read. "It was a war, and the wrong side won." The Oakhaven fire was erased from the history books. The local papers in 1836 reported it as a tragic conflagration that claimed the lives of esteemed citizens. They barely mentioned the slaves. The lawsuits were settled, the money was paid to the banks, and the land was eventually sold and subdivided. Today, if you drive through Lowndes County, there is no marker for Oakhaven. The site is a pasture now, covered in kudzu and scrub pine. The chimney fell down a century ago. But in the archives of the Mobile Historical Society, buried in a box of uncatalogued insurance documents, Blackwood's ledger remains. It lists the names of the 10 dead owners, and it lists the names of the 142 people they took with them. Isaac, Sarah, Cado, Moses, Clara. It records their ages, their skills, and the prices they fetched on a cold February day. It is proof that justice does not always follow vengeance, proof that removing the master does not break the chains if the law itself is the shackle. The fire at Oakhaven was a desperate, violent bid for freedom based on a lie. They thought they were killing their jailers. They didn't realize they were imprisoned in a building much larger than a plantation house, a building made of laws, debts, and property rights that no fire could burn down. History is full of these silences, moments where people fought back and lost, not on the battlefield but in the courtroom. We tell you these stories because the ledger deserves to be read. The names deserve to be spoken. What would you have done? If you were Isaac standing in that pantry with the match, believing the lie of the will, would you have lit it? Or is the hope of freedom, even a false one, worth the risk of total destruction? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story of the Oakhaven fire moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe. Help us keep the ledger open. We'll see you in the next video, where we'll uncover another secret the history books tried to hide.